Good day. In my program yesterday, I began with a brief but careful discussion of the events in Israel and on the Palestinian territories over the previous day. It appeared that some major attack carried out by the Hamas group, which dominates, in fact, essentially controls Gaza, which is one of the Palestinian territories, was taking place. And there were lots of reports of very heavy fighting. And I said that despite the fact that Hamas seemed to have penetrated deep into Israel in a number of places and appeared to be both killing and capturing Israeli soldiers and, as it turns out, taking Israeli civilians hostages, with many Israeli civilians killed also. I said that clearly there had been a massive, almost inexplicable intelligence failure on the part of the Israeli authorities and intelligence services, and it seemed remarkable that an attack of this kind had actually successfully taken place. Well, that comment which I made yesterday is today a commonplace. Now, in saying that, I want to make it clear that I'm not suggesting that many, or indeed any, of the people who have made that comment since or in parallel with me or before me were influenced by anything I said. It's clear that this is an obvious fact, and on the face of it, an inexplicable fact, one which requires very significant explanation. I should say that as recently as the 29th of September, Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, was telling everyone that the Middle East was more calm than it had been for decades. And it seems that a discussion that took place at the highest levels within Israel as recently as last week concluded that there was little prospect of a major Hamas attack, because supposedly the Hamas leadership were concerned not to provoke actions by Israel which might interfere with the significant upswing in the economy of Gaza, which has apparently been underway. So we see how both the Americans and the Israelis were caught completely by surprise. And I should say I've been receiving various messages from various people in Israel, and many of them are baffled and understandably very angry by this. And I've had some suggestions of treachery, that this could only have happened because of treachery. I've had descriptions by people who have served in the Israeli military, the Israeli Defense Forces, of how sophisticated and controlled the border area between Israel and Gaza actually is, how elaborate the security precautions and arrangements that are taken there are, and they all say that it is all but inconceivable that something like this could have happened without someone in Israel or the United States getting wind of it in advance. Well, I've seen all of these things. I've seen specifically the very strong criticism of Prime Minister Netanyahu, which has been made, and I've noticed also that some are seeking to connect these latest events to Prime Minister Netanyahu's own problems. He's been trying to make changes to the position of the Supreme Court in Israel, and this has provoked protests. He's also apparently been, he is the object of various legal proceedings. And of course, there is a comment, a criticism of Prime Minister Netanyahu, which I have seen before, but one which I am sure he personally would take the strongest issue with, that he's not really so connected to Israel, that he's very strong, long-standing contacts in the United States, means that he's closer to opinion in the United States and even the interests of some people in the United States than he is connected and acting in the interests of the people of Israel. Now, I should say I've seen that. I don't myself believe this. I haven't seen much evidence of it, though I qualify that by saying I don't know a huge amount about Israeli politics, or indeed even about Prime Minister Netanyahu's internal position within Israel. But the fact that people are saying this demonstrates, I think, how upset and angry they are. And they got good cause to be. Over the course of the day and continuing into today, the fighting is ongoing. It seems that Hamas was able to capture an entire Israeli army base. There's pictures of destroyed Merkava tanks. These are some of the most sophisticated tanks in the world, apparently. I'm not an expert in these sort of things, but that's what I understand. There's other pictures of Israeli armored vehicles destroyed. There's pictures of captured Israeli soldiers. And there are some very gruesome pictures of people, civilians being killed, of civilians being captured and taken prisoner, of civilians being paraded in appalling circumstances. And of course, there's been the inevitable Israeli reaction. I say inevitable, but Israel has always reacted to these kind of attacks in an overwhelming way. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been talking about Israel being at war. There's comments from other Israeli officials about how at the conclusion of the operation which is coming, Gaza, the city of Gaza, one of the most densely populated cities in the world, will be reduced to a ruin. It's Prime Minister Netanyahu has been telling residents in Gaza to leave. Now, I'm not sure whether that's addressed to the Palestinian residents of Gaza or to Israeli residents in Israeli-controlled areas in the north of what might be called, the Gaza area. But if it is Palestinians living in Gaza City, it's not at all obvious to me or clear to me where these people are supposed to go. But anyway, that's the reports. And there's been already bombing attacks on Gaza by the Israeli Air Force, and there's been missile strikes by Hamas into Israel, and no doubt we'll be seeing more and more counter reactions over the course of the next couple of days. And in the meantime, in southern Lebanon, on Israel's northern border, there are growing signs that the Hezbollah movement, one of the most powerful and well-organized and well-equipped and well-trained and, by the way, experienced militia groups in the world, they've been fighting a long time in the conflicts within Lebanon, in the conflicts between Lebanon, or at least the Shia community in Lebanon, and Israel, and they participated very heavily in the Syrian war. Anyway, Hezbollah, it seems, is now also in action, and there have been cross-border strikes between Hezbollah and the Israeli forces. And as I said, a major battle, intense fighting is going on, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is talking about a long war and is warning Israeli citizens that this is going to be the case. Now, few things to say. I am not going to analyze or explain or discuss the reasons for Israel's intelligence failure. The only thing I will say is that it's clear to me that Israel and the United States has seriously underestimated the sophistication and the degree of control that Hamas now exercises within the Gaza Strip. It's clear that people who Israel assumed were informers within the Hamas movement, apparently there's been a major effort by Israeli intelligence agencies to establish a network of informers in the Gaza Strip. Anyway, it's clear that these people are not informers in any meaningful sense. Some of them, for all I know, are plants that Hamas is itself running. I mean, I'm not going to get into that kind of thing. I'm not going to speculate about it. I don't know. But I'm going to make a number of observations. Despite what Prime Minister Netanyahu says about this evolving into a long war, the reality is that the Israeli military, the Israeli defense forces, massively outmatch Hamas and are able to hold the ground without too much difficulty against Hezbollah in the north. In some form or other, Israel will be able to repel this attack. The Hamas forces within Israel, apparently still quite a few of these, will be pushed back out of Israel proper, back into Gaza-controlled territory, back into Gaza, into Hamas-controlled territory. Nobody should be in any doubt about this. So in terms of repelling this attack, there's no doubt that Israel will achieve that objective. The bigger question for Israel is, what does it do next? And of course, there will be people in Israel, in fact, there already are people in Israel, who say that while Hamas retains control of Gaza, and Gaza, by the way, is now the target of what I understand is an indefinite energy blockade. There's no electricity, for example, being sent to Gaza, which could very well result in a humanitarian catastrophe for the millions of people there. And I think at this point, one must point out and remind the government of Israel that disproportionate reactions, and I appreciate that many Israelis today will feel that no reactions can be disproportionate when Israeli civilians have been killed and in some cases paraded and in other cases held hostage. But disproportionate reactions that target entire populations, civilian populations, including things like energy blockades and such, are war crimes. Now, I say that carefully, but I know of what I speak, and I think Israelis need to be aware of that, and I would strongly counsel them against being drawn into that kind of response. Ultimately, let me repeat again, there was a big Israeli intelligence failure. The better thing to do in these kind of situations, rather than resort to extreme measures like blockades, is to look for military solutions. And one solution might be to undertake a painstaking examination of how this was allowed to happen, what was the cause of the intelligence breakdown, and take steps to ensure that this doesn't happen again, perhaps with a major shakedown of the Israeli intelligence services, perhaps with new Israeli approaches to this, and also perhaps with tightening up security positions. That is always the better way than engaging in war crimes. I don't think I need to explain that. That is an obvious step, I would have thought, for Israel to take. Of course, that still leaves this issue, this greater issue in Gaza unresolved. And I know there are people, some people in Israel, who are talking about Israel reoccupying Gaza, of the Israeli army moving back into Gaza, taking direct control of this city, working to clear out Hamas. I think that would be an extremely difficult and dangerous, and perhaps, and this is my own inexpert view, perhaps impossible operation. I can see how it could go catastrophically wrong. Gaza has a population of millions. It's densely populated. Most of the population supports Hamas. Israeli troops entering Gaza, conducting an operation of that nature, might find themselves there for years. They would find themselves in a kind of urban guerrilla war. That might open the way for more attacks on Israel itself, attacks which the Israeli authorities and the Israeli public would qualify as terroristic. And, well, many years ago, back in the 1960s, there was one of the most exceptional war films ever made, The Battle of Algiers, showing the French attempts to gain control of the old town of Algiers during the insurgency against the French colonial government that took place in the 1950s. The French never fully gained control of Algiers, and in the process, the French military, in their efforts to do so, began to go down the disastrous slope of engaging increasingly in the most egregious human rights abuses, the most extreme violence against civilians, torture, and such things. And in a sense, that kind of conflict in an urban landscape almost inevitably leads to that. And of course, that would have a debilitating effect on Israel itself. Israel would be consumed by this struggle to try to gain control of Gaza. It would be deeply demoralizing and, I suspect, corrupting across Israeli society. And it would be, of course, a massive dislocation and distortion of resources. It would risk involving Israel in a forever war, right on its own borders, with all the disastrous consequences that that leads to. Moreover, that kind of conflict is inevitably going to have an effect across the Arab and Muslim world, and it would harden opinion against Israel. And by the way, it would also harden opinion against the West. It would mean that the conflict in Israel and in the Gaza became the single most important conflict, the one that everybody was talking about. Now, I say that maybe Israel does have a plan to gain control of Gaza and to winkle out Hamas, and that they can do this quickly without any of these results happening. But I see no sign of it. I remember when the United States went into Afghanistan following the events, the 9/11 events. There were lots of predictions that it would all be a relatively straightforward operation for a time. It seemed that it would be so. And of course, what happened was that even the United States became bogged down in that war, and it began to carry a heavy cost for the United States. And I could see how more disastrously it could, for Israel, an attempted occupation of Gaza might result in the same outcome. And of course, it might lead to some people making extreme demands for expulsions of populations and things of that kind, which I would have to say straight away would be, again, a war crime, and one which might have dangerous and unpredictable and profoundly corrupting and unethical consequences as well, consequences which would affect Israel and do so indefinitely. So I think that an attempt to go into Gaza and to carry out that kind of operation would be a mistake. So I think that, just as was the case after 9/11, important for Israel to calculate, to think carefully before it does something which it regrets, as is always the case. Decisions made in anger are often regretted at leisure. Anyway, that's one thing I'm going to say. The second is to ask the question of why this thing actually has happened when it has. Well, the important thing to say is that, of course, Hamas must have been preparing for this for a very long time. This kind of very complex operation requires a lot of planning, a lot of organization, a lot of logistical preparation. It's not something that the Hamas leadership can have thought up in a day or a week and a month. Yesterday, I spoke about the fact that there'd been an incursion into the Al-Aqsa Mosque by Jewish settlers on Friday. There's some people like Bernhard at the Moon of Alabama who see this event, this Hamas attack on Israel, as some kind of response to that event. And the Hamas leadership have themselves said that that is what it was. But I have to say straight away that the long preparation of this event makes it a certainty to my mind that Hamas must have been planning it long before the event on Friday. It seems to me that this is the kind of operation that would have taken weeks or months to plan. And perhaps what took place on Friday may have shaped the timing to some extent, but sooner or later, an event like this would have happened anyway. And I've noticed that in the media in the West, there's been a lot of discussion that Hamas acted in the way that it has because of concern about negotiations between the United States and Saudi Arabia. The United States has been trying to persuade Saudi Arabia to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. There's been talk that this would happen in conjunction with a massive arms deal by the United States for Saudi Arabia, and that the United States would either forge new security guarantees for Saudi Arabia or would renew the security guarantees which Saudi Arabia was provided 70 years ago during that famous meeting between the first Saudi king, King Ibn Saud, and President Roosevelt in the last weeks of the Second World War. So there's been much discussion about this, and there's been some suggestions that this attack by Hamas was intended to block, to stop the progress of these negotiations. I'm going to express some skepticism about this theory. It seems to me that the negotiations haven't been going very well. The United States has apparently been trying to link the price of oil and the conduct of the Saudis in making production cuts to these negotiations. The Saudis apparently have refused that outright. There's been some reluctance, it seems, by the Saudis to move forward with recognition of Israel, which would be a part of this package. So it doesn't seem to me as if this was actually a particularly urgent or pressing problem. And besides, I'm not really sure what this agreement that the United States, that the administration, the Biden administration, is trying to broker with the Saudis, what actual fundamental difference it would make to the political geography of the Middle East. Far more important, surely, is that Saudi Arabia has now taken steps to join BRICS, in fact is joining BRICS, that it's now a observer member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with plans eventually to become a full member, that it has forged close links with Russia through the OPEC Plus arrangements, and that it has achieved a rapprochement with Iran. So I would have thought that all of these things are more important than this negotiation, which anyway doesn't seem to me to be going especially well. And besides, reports about this negotiation have only really circulated in the last few months, and my own guess, and I'm no expert in these matters, is that the work, the preparation for this particular operation by Hamas must have preceded those reports about this negotiation, in which case, of course, they could not have been connected to it. For the record, Hamas, which historically has had a difficult relationship with Saudi Arabia, Hamas is closer to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an organization which ideologically is at odds with the religious leaders of Saudi Arabia. Anyway, Hamas recently has itself been working hard to improve its relations with Saudi Arabia, and it's been making some progress in doing so. And over the course of the last few weeks, apparently a Hamas delegation visited and was warmly received in Riyadh. So I am skeptical about this particular theory. I think a much more straightforward explanation is that Hamas has launched this operation because that is what Hamas does. It has achieved the position amongst the Palestinian community that it has done, and its dominant position in Gaza, precisely because of its unflinching, uncompromising position towards Israel. I am sure that that is the sentiment of many of its supporters and members, and I think that Hamas really doesn't need these kind of external prompts to launch this kind of operation. And besides, by launching an operation of this nature, Hamas has sidelined and perhaps discredited even further the rival Palestinian leadership led by the nominal president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. So I think that this doesn't need to be analysed in that way too deeply. And I would add, by the way, and this takes me back to what I said before, I think that from Hamas's point of view, I would not be surprised if there are certain factions within Hamas which would not be averse to an attempted Israeli occupation of Gaza, a prolongation of the war, a war of resistance against the Israeli occupiers, as they would call it, in Gaza, would actually play into Hamas's narrative and would consolidate their leadership of the Palestinian movement. Lastly, when discussing Hamas and its motives, the capture of hostages is apparently intended to compel Israel to release prisoners, Hamas prisoners, and other Palestinian prisoners that it holds. And again, I would not discount that. I would suggest that that is actually an important motive. Some of these people that Israel holds are likely important, experienced cadres of Hamas. It's completely understandable that Hamas would want these people freed. So I don't think this needs to be analysed too deeply. The third point I'm going to make is that one factor in the timing of this event is perhaps a general perception across the Middle East that the United States, and by extension its ally Israel, are weakening. The United States is perceived to have suffered a defeat in Iraq and an even more serious defeat in Syria. It has seen its position increasingly marginalized. There's been the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and beyond that, there is a general sense that American power globally is weakening as well. And here I'm going to say that the war in Ukraine, the failure of Ukraine's offensive, despite all of the weapons that were poured into Ukraine, the pictures of the burning tanks and burning Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the reports of thousands of tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers killed or wounded, the sense that Russia, having absented itself from the global stage following the end of the Cold War, is now returning to it with growing force, that behind Russia stands China as well. That sense of growing weakness on the part of the United States, growing confusion on the part of the President of the United States. He does not, to put it mildly, cut an impressive or authoritative figure on the world stage. All of that might have given the leadership of Hamas, and indeed many other people amongst the Palestinian community, a sense that the tide is beginning to turn, and it is beginning to turn finally back in their favour, and that this is the moment, therefore, when they should act. And this brings me to two further points. Firstly, it seems to me that Israel also needs to make some careful assessments of its own position. Now, there's been much discussion about Israel. There's been much discussion about the history of the founding of the state. I do not propose to discuss these issues in this program. They're always contentious. One never is able to satisfy everybody. That is an impossible task. and I'm not going to do it in this program. What I will say is this: Israel, for the first decades of its existence, faced a united Arab world. Then in 1978, as a result of a treaty negotiated at Camp David with the mediation of the United States, Israel managed to achieve a peace treaty with the most powerful Arab state, which was Egypt. And that enormously strengthened Israel's strategic position. And thereafter, that fact, together with the fact that Israel was in possession of nuclear weapons, in effect meant that Israel was no longer the beleaguered place that it had once been. And since then, things have not always gone well. There was a war in Lebanon in 1982, which didn't go well for Israel, and over the course of which Israel experienced a major moral disaster when Christian militias allied to Israel carried out massacres in Palestinian refugee camps. And of course, there was an even bigger disaster for Israel when Israel found itself locked in combat with various Shia militia groups in Lebanon, which eventually consolidated into Hezbollah, obliging Israel to retreat from Lebanon. And then there was a war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006, the consequences of which, by the way, should never be underestimated. In my opinion, the Syrian war was a direct product of it. But again, that is another story to discuss another day. Anyway, all of that cumulatively shows that Israel, even during this period since the treaty with Egypt, has not been having things all its own way. But nonetheless, Israel's strategic position, if one discounts these defeats, has been improving. Support for Israel in the West has consolidated. I can remember that in the 1970s, for example, there are many people in the West, including within Western governments and Western political parties, who are deeply skeptical about Israel and its policies. You don't see or hear much of that anymore. Israel has been able to normalize relations with several other Arab states. It's forged peace treaties with Jordan as well as Egypt. And during the period of Donald Trump's administration, it has established diplomatic relations with some of the Gulf states, some of the Arab Gulf states. So Israel has enjoyed a period of security and stability during this period. But the one thing it has not done and has shown little interest in doing is take steps to resolve the festering problem at its heart, which is the issue, the resolution of the relationship, its relationship with the Palestinian community that, of course, occupied this territory, the entirety of this territory, before Israel itself was established. There have been attempts to do this. There was that attempt at Oslo all those years ago between Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister of that time, and Yasser Arafat and the PLO leadership. But in recent decades, as Israel has seemed more secure, as its overall position in the Middle East appeared to be normalizing, one has got the sense that the Israelis themselves have stopped thinking about this problem, and to the extent that they do think about it, they think about it purely in what might be called police terms. And I use that word, by the way, carefully. One could come up with much stronger words. So we've had walls, we've had fortified borders, we've had extraordinary laws passed in Israel, we've had, in effect, all kinds of steps taken by Israel to control the Palestinian population, but never really to seek or forge a viable peace with them, which shows any understanding of their concerns or their wider aspirations, or which recognizes their grievances. And the result is that this has, in part, opened space for organizations like Hamas to take root, and it is leaving Israel with the problem that it faces today. Always felt that Israel was wasting the best opportunity that it had when it was in its strongest position to achieve peace. I understand that there are many people in Israel who will respond that seeking peace is a fool's errand, that the opponents that they face are implacable and will rest at nothing less than Israel's total destruction. And they will point to the fact that Hamas's founding documents say as much. But I can't help myself but think that a lot more could have been done at that time. A serious effort to resolve this problem should have been sought, and Israeli politicians instead became complacent and didn't seek it. And that complacency appears to have spread to the Israeli military and to the Israeli intelligence agencies, which no doubt in part explains the extraordinary failure we have just seen. Well, perhaps the most optimal moment has passed, but Israel's position remains extremely strong. The global environment still remains favorable. The United States remains an ally. Europe, as I said, the doubts that once existed appear to have gone. And Russia, which has in the past supported the Arabs, is now, if not exactly a friend, at least a country which seeks good relations with Israel. So I think a serious effort to rethink the relationship with the Palestinians is now urgent. Now, there is one other factor that may be playing a role in these events, and it's not one that I'm able to discuss in any great detail, but there's been much talk about ammunition shortages in the conflict in Ukraine. I've discussed those at length in many programs. Well, it's been suggested that Hamas has been aware of this for some time, and they are aware of the fact that the United States has withdrawn ammunition from Israel, American reserve stocks that were held in Israel, which would have been made available to Israel in a moment of crisis, and that this might have emboldened them as well. I don't know whether that is true or not. Hamas absolutely does not share its views with me one way or the other. It's something, a tantalizing possibility, but it's one which obviously I'm not really in a position to discuss. Now, I've spoken at length, I've discussed many aspects of these events. I've not talked about the ethics of this. I've not talked about the fact that Gaza, according to many people, has been under blockade for many years. As I said, I've avoided discussing the history, the long history of this, conflict going back not just to the foundation of the State of Israel, but even before. I've not talked about the violence. I will say straight away this. The pictures that I have seen coming out yesterday are profoundly shocking, and they should be unequivocally condemned. Targeting civilians in the way that was done is terrorism, as far as I'm concerned, and I understand. In fact, law, international law and war crimes law makes clear. And doing this in the way that has been done qualifies as such. I don't want to start getting into a situation where I'm saying, that this side does these sort of things, but the other side does other things that are equally bad or worse. But unfortunately, when discussing this conflict, that is also true. I've already talked about the blockade of Gaza, the talk about bombing Gaza, the kind of things that might happen if Israel were to occupy Gaza. And I've not talked about the longer history there either. What all this means to me is that it is even more important for both of the communities, both the Palestinian and the Israeli, to try and achieve peace, because they should think hard about what this conflict is causing them to do, or has caused them to do, or may cause them to do in the future. And as somebody who has witnessed extreme levels of political violence in my childhood, I know how debilitating and corrupting that is over time. Anyway, there we are. Now, one thing, again, I'm not going to discuss in this program, because I don't know anything about it, is the role of Iran in this affair. The British media, some people in the British media are full of this. It's been suggested that Iran has deliberately orchestrated this event. Maybe it has. I can't, again, see why it would want to do so. At the moment, Iran has been making significant progress in terms of its diplomacy. It's engineered, or it's managed to achieve a successful rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. It's forging close links with Russia and, by extension, China as well. It's even apparently succeeded to some extent in sorting out some of its problems with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Why would the Iranians make their life more difficult than it already is by inciting Hamas to conduct an operation of this kind at this time? I don't see it. It doesn't make any sense to me. But then again, I am not an expert on Iranian politics. It could be that there are different factions in Iran, in Tehran, that, and one of them might have played a role here. But to be frank, I rather doubt it. But anyway, those are my thoughts about this conflict for the moment. It's going to develop, it's going to evolve. It is probably the most serious conflict that is taking place at the moment. I suspect, as I said, that over the next couple of days, the Israeli Defense Forces will bring this immediate situation under control. But of course, the longer, deeper problems will remain. And until there is a sustained effort to find a solution to them, they will probably deteriorate and get worse. So this remains the single greatest fault line in international relations, the most dangerous one of all. But how this will evolve and whether the war will spread, and whether the fighting with Hezbollah will intensify, and whether it might draw in neighbouring powers, that, I'm afraid, remains to be seen. And I will discuss that in future programmes. Well, as you will all have understood, I have chosen my words incredibly carefully, extremely carefully over the course of this programme. For that, by the way, I apologise, but the constraints I work under, the sensitivities of the main platform make that unavoidable. And I wish I could speak perhaps more simply, but there it is. Now, this has been a programme about this gigantic event that we've seen. By the way, I should say that I have experienced something like this twice before in my life. I can just remember, just at the tip of my memory, the shock of the Tet Offensive that was launched by the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War in 1968. And I also remember the shock of the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And by the way, it may not be a coincidence that this event took place on its anniversary, though I think more likely Hamas was simply launching this attack to take advantage of the Jewish holiday at a time when the Israel would have been even more off its guard. But anyway, I remember both of those shocks, this sense that these events had come out of a clear blue sky. This is on that kind of scale. Anyway, let's move on. And let's move back to that perennial topic, which is the war in Ukraine. This has been the topic that has dominated my programs now, well, since we had all those first precursors, the rumblings that preceded it in the autumn of 2021. It's dominated my program since. Could very well be the case if this conflict in the Middle East continues and aggravates, that it will finally push it aside. We shall see. But anyway, what has been going on in Ukraine? Well, I'm going to, for once, discuss these in somewhat summary fashion, though I do think that important events now are taking place. And these important events are concentrated on the northern front lines. There's an accumulation of reports now that the Russians have once more begun a major advance towards Kupiansk, and we're starting to get comments from Russian officials to that effect. And it's we've had a comment from one Russian official about the situation in close to Kupiansk, and if I can just look to this, it's here we go. It's from we have Viktor Vodolatsky, who is a member, an MP, a Russian MP of the State Duma. He coordinates parliamentary relations with the Lugansk People's Republic. In other words, he is the Lugansk People's Republic's representative in the Duma. The Lugansk People's Republic did not participate, obviously, in the last Duma elections, because at that time, the Lugansk People's Republic was not, under Russian law, part of Russia. In the forthcoming elections, which are taking place next year, it will do so. So it will return MPs to the Russian parliament. But in the meantime, its interests in the parliament are represented by Viktor Vodolatsky. Anyway, he said that he said that Russian forces are now gradually advancing towards Kupiansk, with 7 to 12 kilometers left to go at different sections. And we've also had reports that troops from Battle Group West, which is one of the Russian forces, supported by aviation, artillery and TOS-1 flamethrower systems, has repelled 5 Ukrainian counterattacks near Makeyevka in the Lugansk People's Republic. And there are now growing reports that the Russians have actually reached the outskirts of Makeyevka. This is an important fortified village, one of those other places in the Ukrainian fortified lines, which the Ukrainians have embedded themselves into and which the Russians are intending to capture, or so it seems. Now, there's more reports that suggest that the Russians now are intent on carrying out some kind of big knockout blow against the Ukrainian forces in Kupiansk and along the Oskol River. The Ukrainians continue to rush reinforcements to this area, though these reinforcemements have not so far been able to stem the Russian advance. And there's lots of reports, lots of suggestions that the Russians have allowed the Ukrainians to reinforce in this area, essentially in order to prepare the ground for a Russian attack in Kupiansk and for a destruction of a large part of the Ukrainian military that appears to be concentrated in this area, though it should be said that from what I can see, these tend to be second-line brigades. Now, yesterday, there was a very interesting video on the new Atlas with Brian Beletic and Scott of Calibrated, and they were discussing various scenarios in the war. But anyway, I noticed that Scott of Calibrated and Brian Beletic discussed the overall situation on the battlefronts. There was a generally discounted this idea that the Ukrainians are in any condition to launch an amphibious assault across the Dnieper River. Neither of them seemed to think that this was a likely prospect. Well, we'll see. And as I said, I noticed that they didn't mention the weather conditions, but apparently they are becoming increasingly less favourable to any kind of operation of that kind. So that's the first thing. But they also said that, in fact, they confirmed a point that I've made myself, which is that now all across the front lines in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, in the Vremevka salient area, in Bakhmut, and as we see in the north, it is the Russians who are now on the attack and who are gradually increasing pressure. And Scott of Calibrated suggested that the Russians are not actually planning at the moment some great knockout blow. What they're doing is that they're increasing the pressure constantly on an increasingly weakened Ukrainian military. Russian forces have become much stronger, they're better trained, they're better equipped, they're becoming more numerous all the time. I've discussed this in many programs on this channel, so has Brian Beletic, so have others, so has my friend Alex Christoforo. We have done it on the Duran too. And of course, Scott Ritter has also been talking about it, and so has Douglas McGregor, and so have many others. Anyway, the Russians are getting stronger, the Ukrainians are getting weaker. The Russian strategy, for the moment at least, is not to push hard, not to go for broke through a big arrow offensive. Rather, it is to press the Ukrainians at every point in the line until a breach is caused. The Ukrainians are then compelled to feed in what reserves and troops they have to plug whatever gap is created. That will create more opportunities for the Russians in other parts of the front line, and the result will be that at some point a cascade effect will set in, and the entire front line, the entire Ukrainian position, will crumble. Now, that may still be some time off, but it is the prospect. It is increasingly the prospect. It is perhaps what we are looking towards. So that's overall the situation on the front lines. In the other places, in Rabotino, Verbovoye, Kremevka salient, Bakhmut, the initiative now is with the Russians. The Ukrainians do try attacks on foot now in all of these places from time to time. The Russians appear to be finding it easier all the time to repel these attacks. The Ukrainians continue to experience extremely heavy losses, and the Russians in every part of the front line have been able now to go on the attack and, in fact, gradually, incrementally, to increase the pressure and to gain ground. Now, even as that is happening, we see continuing discussions in the United States. And there was a very interesting article in the Daily Telegraph that some members of the administration, I'm going to suggest here that we're talking about the Victoria Nuland faction, are now lobbying for a single bill of financial and military support for Ukraine to be presented to Congress. $100 billion apparently is being discussed. It's suggested that this will cover all Ukrainian costs and expenses up to the November election and beyond, up to, in other words, the moment when the new president, or perhaps the existing president, is inaugurated or re-inaugurated in January 2025. So this will be a $100 billion package, and it seems that the president himself, President Biden, is inclined to this idea. It's a way of railroading through a major spending package for Ukraine, supposedly covering all of Ukraine's costs until January 2025, hopefully in that way taking the issue of funding from Ukraine away as a political issue in the forthcoming election. That's the idea anyway. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I would be far from saying that this idea will fail. It's not impossible that it will eventually, a spending bill of this nature will indeed be tabled before Congress at some point, and it could be that it will be put to the vote. And I said that the Democrats are likely to support it, and there'll almost certainly be enough Republicans in the House who would support it also, and definitely in the Senate, and it could be voted through. So I am not saying that this won't happen. But contrary to what President Biden and his team may think, were this to happen, it would come, or so it seems to me, with significant political risks. Because I don't think Ukraine's problems ultimately are down to a lack of money. Ukraine's problems are because its manpower reserves are becoming exhausted, the population is becoming exhausted, the Russian military is becoming more powerful, and Western arms stocks are becoming exhausted as well. And on top of that, If there is a prolonged war in the Middle East, Ukraine will now have to compete with Israel for priority in terms of arms deliveries and shipments from the United States. And I suspect that the inclination amongst people in Congress would in that case be to support Israel in advance of Ukraine. And I think that might also be the sentiment on the part of many people in the administration and in the Pentagon also. So I think those are, this money isn't going to resolve the problems. It's money. It's not in itself shells or more tanks or other machines. And I think this is a point which needs to be borne in mind. Obviously, if American economic support tails off, there will be severe problems in Ukraine's economy, and these will get much worse. But can I just say, and without discounting the importance of that, if one looks behind the curtain of the reality of the life that most Ukrainians are experiencing, those economic problems are already there. So it's unlikely that this $100 billion package is going to change the situation for Ukraine for the better in any significant way. Briefly, it might cause morale in Ukraine to lift up, but within a few weeks, as the effect wore off and it became clear that all of this money was making no real difference, morale would fall off again. So it's not going to change the situation in Ukraine. But there's a major military defeat in Ukraine over the course of 2024, which, to be frank, looks to me increasingly likely. Then, going into the election, President Biden becomes the man who blew another $100 billion, blew it on Ukraine. He's already reputedly sent $113 billion tax dollars to Ukraine since the conflict began, and he will have added another $100 billion on top of that. Given that support for funding for Ukraine is falling and is now falling dramatically amongst Democrats as well, that doesn't seem to me a good call at all. And I can see that far from helping the president through the election, this appropriation, this bill, this funding bill, if it's ever passed, well, it seems to me ultimately that it's actually more likely in the end to cause him problems. That's, of course, assuming that this bill passes. And there we come back to the fundamental issue of what happens with this battle to decide who the new Speaker of the House is going to be. Now, Donald Trump is endorsing Jim Jordan as Speaker. There's suggestions that a gentleman by the name of Mr. Scalise, about whom I know absolutely nothing, might perhaps be a more plausible possibility for Speaker. I'm not saying one way or the other. But I'm going to suggest that Mr. Jordan, if he is elected Speaker with the endorsement of Donald Trump, he comes from the populist wing of the party. He, it seems to me, has already made clear that he's sceptical of financial aid for Ukraine. I think he will probably want to oppose this idea of a $100 billion package for Ukraine. I wonder whether perhaps he might reject all aid for Ukraine entirely. And of course he must know, as any future Republican Speaker must know, that any Speaker who allows a package like this to go before the House and to be voted on there risks having the same thing done to them that has just been done to Speaker McCarthy, or should say former Speaker McCarthy. So I'm going to guess that Jim Jordan will not look with favour upon this idea and might in fact block appropriations entirely. And of course it could be that Mr. Scalise, even if he is elected, might be as sceptical as well. I don't know one way, I don't know this for certain, but anyway, that's how briefly it looks to me. I wonder whether this is even a real plan, whether the tactic now might be on the part of some people in the administration not to secure more funding for Ukraine, but rather to find ways of blaming any collapse in Ukraine on the Republicans, saying that the administration has done everything it possibly can, but a group of Putin apologists or supporters in the House of Representatives within the Republican Party have blocked all attempts to save Ukraine, and that if there is a debacle in Ukraine next year, well, it is entirely down to them. Now that would make perhaps some sense in terms of US domestic politics if it is true, but it would illustrate, it would highlight the extent to which Ukraine, from being the great totemic issue of our time, as we were being told by the administration, by the president, by the leaders of the West last year and for much of this year, how Ukraine, from that position, has now become a political football in the endless game of American domestic politics. Well, this is where I leave my program today. Unusual in that it is not dominated by Ukrainian events. We shall see, as I said, what happens in the Middle East. My own sense, I've said this before, is that where Ukraine is concerned, one way or the other, we're now starting to see the end of the affair. Brian Beletic and Scott have calibrated, discussed in that programme possible outcomes to the war, what the future political geography of Ukraine and Eastern Europe might look like. They made some interesting points, which I will want to discuss and might discuss in my next programme. But I think today this is where I'm going to stop. So thank you again for joining me. Just to remind you that you can find all our programmes on Locals and Rumble. You can also find our programmes on X and on other platforms too. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You find the links under this video. Don't forget to go to our shop. You can buy all kinds of amazing things there, and we are running a sale at the moment. You can buy things at a 20% discount, and by the way, we are in the process, or rather Alex Christoforou, my colleague, is in the process of carrying out a major upgrade of the shop. So keep an eye on what goes on there. And in the meantime, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me once more. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.